From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, November 16th. It was big news at the time. In 2019, Australian federal police officers, wearing black suits and clutching briefcases, raided the ABC's headquarters in Sydney before an array of journalists and photographers who were there to capture their every move. The AFP were investigating a leak of documents that formed the basis of a series of stories called the Afghan Files. The source of those documents was military lawyer David McBride, who faces jail time after he was charged with disclosing the confidential information. Today, reporter Angus Thompson on the trial of David McBride, which began in court this week, and the question of duty and who it was owed to, the Defence Force or the Australian public. Angus, I want to start this conversation by talking about who David McBride is and why we're talking about him this week.
We're talking about him because he's facing a jury trial in the ACT Supreme Court for leaking confidential documents to journalists about allegations of war crimes in Afghanistan. McBride was a former military lawyer. He was also a former soldier. He served in both the British and Australian armies. But we know about him because after his second tour of Afghanistan in 2013, he came in contact with some journalists who he disclosed confidential information to about investigations afoot into allegations of war crimes in Afghanistan. And those documents went on to form the Afghan Files.
I saw innocent people killed who didn't need to die.
They were the stories that would spark the federal police raids on the ABC.
Welcome. Right now, Australian Federal Police are still conducting their day-long raid here at the ABC headquarters in Sydney.
That had huge ramifications for the Australian Defence Force and led to what is known as the Brereton Report, which in 2020 found that there was credible evidence of Australian soldiers being involved in at least 39 unlawful killings in Afghanistan.
This isn't about questioning the courage of our elite soldiers, men who operated at the tip of the spear. Rather, it's about trying to determine if some of what they did in Afghanistan broke the laws of war.
They were working in a highly complex...
But McBride, what we know about his intention is that he actually wasn't trying to expose those war crimes in and of themselves, but rather what he believed was the over-investigation of Australian soldiers in Afghanistan by senior members of the Australian Defence Force.
And Angus, at some point, David McBride was charged for handing over these documents, though, to the ABC. So can you tell me about that, when it happened, and what those charges actually were?
So in September 2018, David McBride was charged with theft of Commonwealth property. Then in March 2019, he was charged with a further 4 offences relating to the disclosure of classified documents between 2013 and 2017, including breaching the Defence Act.
What are you charged with?
There's 5 charges. One's theft of pieces of paper, and the other charges are related to speaking to journalists and giving them information.
How long might you spend in prison if found guilty?
The rest of my life, the maximum is like...
The court case began this week, and you've been there covering it. What's it been like, and how does David McBride seem?
David McBride entered the court complex on Monday, surrounded by more than 100 supporters. He is seen as a whistleblower. He walked into the complex with his fist raised in the air.
Supporters greeted Mr McBride as he arrived at court.
Today, I serve my country.
Also with a therapy dog named Jake by his side, which he's been allowed to have in court.
And the question I have for you, Anthony Albanese, is who do you serve?
Now, while we've been sitting in court hearing about legal arguments before the jury trial is set to get underway, what has also been happening in federal parliament this week are calls for Attorney General Mark Dreyfus to intervene in the prosecution of David McBride because he is seen as a whistleblower. Now, what Mark Dreyfus has told Parliament is that he is only allowed to intervene in prosecutions in exceptional circumstances, and to do so in this case could actually risk politicising the case and taking away the independence of Commonwealth prosecutions in carrying out their duties.
So Angus, David McBride initially couldn't claim what's known as the whistleblower defence, a law introduced in 2013 that allows people to claim for immunity from prosecution on public interest grounds. So if McBride can't rely on that, what sort of argument has he been making?
So what I have to stress is that these arguments being played out in court this week are legal arguments ahead of what's going to be put to the jury. What they've been saying and centering on is about his duty to do what he did. So his defence barrister, Stephen Odgers SC, has been telling the judge, David Mossop, that his client did breach orders by revealing confidential documents to journalists. However, he was acting in accordance with a higher duty as a member of the military to serve the public interest under the King. So in other words, while he may have been breaching orders, what he was still doing was adhering to a higher purpose, in obeying the public interest, essentially. Now, this didn't necessarily fly with the Crown prosecutor, Patricia MacDonald SC, who basically refuted all of that and said, the military is the military, soldiers need to obey orders, they need to follow orders. And if they don't, that basically sheds the very essence of what it means to be a member of the ADF. So there really is this key debate going on at the moment about what duty is within the ADF and whether McBride was actually compliant with his duty in carrying out the actions that he did.
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering if you could take us through what David McBride's barrister said in response to the Crown prosecutor when she argued that, well, actually, that's the very definition of a soldier, is to obey orders. But I think that McBride's barrister had a very fascinating response to that.
Well, he absolutely had a very fascinating response. He said that in modern Australia, military service didn't necessarily equate to following orders blindly. Now, he brought in a very potent example of that, and I want to quote from what he said. He said, "For the Crown to make the contention that the duty of the armed forces is to obey unquestioningly a lawful order ignores Nuremberg, ignores the acceptance in our society that members of the military have higher duties." Now, we all know Nuremberg is the German city synonymous with war crimes trials where Nazi soldiers justified acts of brutality by saying they were just following orders. So for him to bring in that example is quite a punchy way of trying to deliver the point that orders are not the same thing as carrying out one's duty.
We'll be right back. Angus, what else has come out of this trial so far? What else do we know about what the Commonwealth, which is prosecuting McBride, has said about the case?
So the Crown prosecutor, Patricia MacDonald, told the court that basically the Crown's position was, well, we don't see it, that McBride was acting in the public interest when he did what he did. And she pointed to his admission that what he was doing was for the intention of actually trying to reveal that soldiers were being over-investigated. And she said that the Crown will say that the evidence establishes that he gave those documents to journalists, hoping that they would support his position that Special Forces troops were being investigated when there was no proper basis to investigate them. What his barrister, Stephen Odgers, is arguing is that what he was actually trying to expose was illegal behaviour on the part of the senior brass by carrying out these investigations where they were unnecessarily doing so, essentially, and that there was unfair weight being put on the soldiers carrying out their actions in the field for doing what they were doing, essentially. An interesting point that Patricia McDonald made to the judge was quoting McBride from a record of interview when he told the investigators that the journalist used the material to publish, quote, the opposite of what I believed. So there we see the contrast in the information that he provided eventually unearthed and his original intention.
So perhaps a final question about the government saying it's going to strengthen our whistleblower laws. Is there any movement on this? And what could stronger whistleblower laws have meant for David McBride?
So there are protections for whistleblowers in Australia, but we haven't seen a case successfully argued using such a law. For example, Richard Boyle worked in the ATO's Debt Recovery Division in Adelaide and made headlines in 2018 when he spoke out against his employer in a joint media investigation by The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and ABC's Four Corners.
Richard Boyle, stand with! Richard Boyle, stand with!
Boyle is one of 2 whistleblowers facing criminal charges by the Commonwealth.
Whistleblowers make Australia a better place. They should be protected, not punished.
Boyle had sought to rely on what's called the Public Interest Disclosure Act, the whistleblowing law for public servants, to shield from a criminal trial in relation to 23 of the charges. He applied for a declaration from the court that he was immune from prosecution, but Boyle lost that fight. His case is still going, but it was the first time the defence had been argued in court. The laws shield a person who makes a public interest disclosure from any civil, criminal or administrative liability.
In recent months, there's been a groundswell in support for stronger whistleblower protections.
Boyle and McBride's case prompted an open letter composed by people like the Commonwealth Bank whistleblower Jeff Morris and Peter Fox, who helped trigger a royal commission into institutional child sex abuse. That letter said that since the Albanese government had come into power, it had done little except make further promises and offer empty platitudes.
What you are seeing here today is the whole of the crossbench uniting and saying to the Albanese government, drop the charges against Mr.
When will you fix whistleblower protection?
Treat the whistleblower as a hero, not a villain.
The prosecutions are having a chilling effect on whistleblowing in Australia.
Thank you, Angus, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
On Wednesday, after we recorded this interview, the judge overseeing David McBride's case ruled that McBride had no duty that allowed him to disobey military orders and leak secret documents in the name of public interest. McBride's legal team said that they will appeal the decision to the ACT Court of Appeal. If they are unsuccessful, it will mean that McBride cannot argue before a jury trial, now set to begin on Monday, that he was acting in the public interest. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills, with technical assistance by Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Salinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.